Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
With a shutdown deadline fast approaching, questions are mounting about which contracts will be paused, who will be furloughed, and how the government's contractor workforce should prepare. The ripple effects could hit everything from IT services to facility support, especially in agencies without full-year funding. We get perspective now from the president of the Professional Services Council, Stephanie Castro. Stephanie, great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
As we sit here on Tuesday, September 30th, we are maybe 24 hours from a shutdown, maybe not. If we don't shut down, though, we'll be back in this conversation 6 or 7 weeks from now. So I'd really love to have you talk us through, from PSC's perspective, what is going on in the world of contractors right now?
It's a great question. And I just want to make sure we could level set, Terry. Since fiscal year 1977, which really is calendar 76, there have only been 3 years that have started under full year appropriations. So continuing resolutions, when people say, let's get back to normal order, I don't know about many of your listening audience, but 1976 was a very long time ago. And for only 3 years, and for those of you playing along at home, that was 1997, 1995, and 1989. Those were the 3 years that started with full year appropriations. So this drill of continuing resolutions and the constant specter of a shutdown is nothing new to those of us living in the United States, and specifically those of us living in the National Capital Region. Contractors in particular, look at this situation and go, we just want funding certainty. That's the thing. And for those companies right now who are operating with fiscal year 2025 obligations, funding, whether or not there's a shutdown, it's business as usual, right? They are going to continue to do their work under contract until that funding runs out, or they receive a stop work order or termination notice. And so for those contractors who have money in the pipeline from previous fiscal years, they're doing fine. It's the folks who, when that money runs out, or they're dependent on new appropriations here coming up in fiscal 26, who are scratching their heads going, how do we deal with this uncertainty?
Well, contractors have had a lot of ups and downs over the last few months as contracts have been terminated for convenience, or there have been stop work notices. And we talk a lot about the impact of a shutdown on the federal workforce, but we don't talk a lot about the impact of that on the contract workforce. So kind of walk us through how all of this is playing out and what point we've reached.
Absolutely. Before we get to the contractor side, though, Terry, something you just said triggered a thought in me, which was we should also be talking about the federal workforce, particularly with recent Office of Management and Budget guidance for agencies to come up with plans to terminate employment for civilians, right? Going forward, if they're not deemed essential under a shutdown, could they be subject to termination going forward? So that piece of it, I think, is worth highlighting, because our contractors depend so much on relationships with their contracting officers in the government, with their program managers and their program offices. And if those people are suddenly no longer there, it does make life difficult for contractors. That said, there was a law passed back in 2019 that if a federal civilian and military too, once they come back to work after a shutdown, they get fully compensated in terms of their pay. No such legislation exists for contractors. And so if they are sent home, if they're furloughed because of a stop work order, for example, they are not guaranteed back pay. So contracting companies are thinking through this going, all right, what can we do instead of furloughing or terminating employment? Can we ask the employees to go ahead and take all of their annual leave that they've built up, et cetera, because they budgeted for that. So one of the important steps for all contracting companies is to understand, where are their people? How much leave do they have? Could they take instead of being furloughed? And really, what does their cash flow situation look like to make sure that they are keeping their employees? And, to be honest, Terry, Professional Services Council, we represent services solution contractors. We are a people business. And so keeping the people in this business is critical for survival of our industry.
I'm speaking with Stephanie Castro. She's the president of the Professional Services Council. Well, Stephanie, let's keep talking about people for a minute, because there's been such a loss of institutional knowledge over the past few months. As you point out, federal workers have left, but also contracts have been downsized or shifted. How is the federal contract space thinking about that human capital in the longer run?
That's a great question, Terry, because again, we are nothing if we're not our people, right? And so as we move forward, given everything that's happened since January with stop work orders, with contract terminations for convenience, et cetera, we've encouraged our member companies to really look at diversifying their portfolios. Some companies have done work outside of their typical federal agency. And I'll give you an example of companies that used to work with the U.S. Agency for International Development. That agency has now ceased to exist. It's been subsumed into the State Department. So they're still working with State Department, but maybe they're diversifying to Health and Human Services or to Department of Homeland Security, where they can have a more steady stream of work and of contract viability. We've also encouraged them really to look at state and local governments. What can they offer there, for example, or the NGO community? How can they partner with them to help, particularly when it comes to international development? Some of those skills are transferable to work here at home. In addition, we've been talking to folks about, what do they do under a shutdown? So again, continuing resolution is sort of the name of the game and has been for the last 50 years. And so what happens under a shutdown to make sure that they understand they need to communicate with their government interlocutors, their colleagues over in whatever building they're in, and then also to document, to make sure that they have a good documentation trail of, we've had these communications with these particular civil servants or military personnel, and these steps were taken in terms of a contract, and then also to plan what happens if we have a continuing resolution that extends just before Thanksgiving. I think the date that I heard was November 21st. We're going to be facing this cliff, as you said it earlier, again, with the potential for another CR or a shutdown, and what happens there. I would highlight, Terry, when we have a CR that expires in, say, the November, December, January timeframe, a lot of times previous fiscal year money is no longer available. So right now, I'm not saying we're okay. I am saying that there are a lot of contracts that are being worked right now that have previous fiscal year's funding. That may not be the case coming up in November and December. And so we are watching this very closely.
So, Stephanie, you mentioned several things there. You mentioned workforce planning. You mentioned liquidity and cash flow management, diversification of contracts, and then planning. As we sit here on the 30th of September, it's a little late to be going, oh my gosh, a shutdown, but it might not be too late for the next one. What are the key things that you want your contractor population to be thinking of, but also the government folks who are going to still be working? What do you want them to be thinking about?
I love how you quickly summarized what I was saying earlier. I really, really appreciate the Cliff Notes version there. There are 6 things, actually, that we are asking folks to think about before a shutdown, right? One is, again, those relationships. What is the availability of the government personnel that you normally deal with, right? That could be a contracting officer representative, or a contracting officer termination representative, right? If you're trying to work through that termination settlement proposal process. That's the first thing. Are the people there who you want to talk to? The second is, can you access the government sites and facilities that you want to access, that you need to access to do your work? For example, you're a Pentagon, you normally sit at the Pentagon. Will you be allowed in under a shutdown? And so there's an issue with that. The third is, expect that there are going to be delays in processing and paying invoices. So get all of your invoices in and get them accepted as soon as possible. The fourth is, hey, there may be delays in completing contracts and accepting deliverables. So how are you going to sequence your calendar for that? The fifth is, let's look to the future. There are going to be delays in solicitations, evaluations, and awards. I will note statutory deadlines for protests, et cetera, they don't change under a shutdown. Those clocks still tick. So I just wanted to highlight that for you. And the sixth thing that we ask people to think about, if you have an option to be exercised, there will be challenges on that. And so I think those 6 things, the availability of government personnel, the availability of facilities, and then delays in invoicing, solicitations, completing contracts, and exercising options. Those are the 6 big things that we're encouraging companies to look at.
And just one final question. If we do go to a shutdown, it's very difficult for contractors to get their government representatives perhaps to answer a phone call. How do they manage in that interstitial period, right, when nobody's picking up the phone?
It's funny you should say that, Terry. We had a member brief back on September 2nd where we started encouraging people to say, reach out to your contracting officers and those who might be accepting your deliverables and say, hey, if you're not there because you took the deferred resignation package or because, you're retiring, or because you might be furloughed or otherwise told to stay home because you're not essential. Who do we talk to? We've been beating this drum for about a month, so I'm glad that you're beating the drum alongside me, Terry. But you really need to figure out who's going to be left to answer the phone or an email under conditions of a shutdown. And that's just good business planning throughout the year, not just on October 1st.
I've been speaking with Stephanie Castro. She's president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thanks as always for your practical insights.
Terry, it's been a pleasure, and let's see what happens.
Indeed. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.